Here I've written sort of an outline of what I'll talk about, and that is plenty. I don't know whether I can cover everything or not. Dialogue between civilizations, Muslims and the West. First of all, if we're going to talk about this, we have to define our terms. We've kind of defined Muslims and Islam somewhat, although probably not enough for this subject. But we haven't defined civilization or the West, and all of these concepts are somewhat problematical. Civilization means or relates to the Latin word for city. And since ancient polities were city-states, it also relates to the word citizen, citizenship, and so on. So it has relations to these concepts. And historically, in Western discourse, has been used to distinguish civilization from barbarism, or civilization from primitivism, and such things. So civilized is good, and what is set in opposition to it usually is not. And historically, this has not led to bias against Islam so much as bias against primal peoples, such as Indian tribes and so on, because they were viewed as uncivilized in pre-modern, or say the early modern past, the pre-contemporary past, and were put down as a result. And I think, as I said in another lecture, when you get right down to it, the definition of civilization is what has writing more than any other distinguishing characteristic. It's the presence of writing, even though the Incas were the exception that proved the rule, had no writing, and are accorded the title civilization. So that they make that is an exception in that case, and the other accoutrements of civilization were enough that they consider it civilization, especially its impressively large state that sprawled over South America from Ecuador to Chile. So civilization is kind of an artificial concept to some extent, and undoubtedly it should not be seen as something that's just, well, I mean, it has been historically something that has put a kind of an opposition between primal and small-scale religions and cultures and large-scale ones, and that probably should not be viewed invidiously if we want to be academically proper and correct now. The West is, of course, a very problematic concept because it's connected with civilization. When we speak of Western civilization, our colleges and universities usually have Western civilization course or series of courses, often mandatory as at Temple University, although sometimes it is masked by using other names for it. So at Temple University it's called intellectual heritage, and the term Western doesn't appear in it. But we know what that means, basically. Western civilizational heritage, it's something ingrained in us through all our textbooks, and even though ancient Iraqi and ancient Egyptian civilization, for example, have kind of been tacked on, it generally sort of goes Greece, Rome, medieval Europe, modern Europe, and world. And that is represented as a particular civilized tradition, and other traditions outside of that could still be civilizational, but they are separate from it, and usually indifferent, and they are not taught except as area studies or marginal things generally. And the thing about the West is that the West is a civilizational identification that is not an ethnic or a historical term, but is a geographical one. And to a large extent, that does not fit what is said of the other areas in the world and their civilizations. We talk about Indian civilization, and it's only recently become more politically correct to talk about South Asian in order to separate between the political state of modern India and the region, which also includes Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Nepal and Bhutan. And we've talked about Chinese civilization more than Far Eastern or East Asian, although that does arise as well. So the geographical terminology itself is somewhat odd because it tends to limit and locate that in some area perceived as the West, Western Europe, and what is west of that, Canada and the United States, and also perhaps by extension and affiliation, the Latin American area. So that you have this as the West and everything else is not the West. And it provides a kind of a decisive boundary where you don't have an expression of gray areas, but it's somewhat geographically defined, and it tends then to deny pluralism inside the area. On the other hand, probably for a shorthand in teaching, we need some kind of terminology. And so it wouldn't be thought that this was invented with malice aforethought, it was just something that arose. The terming of it as the West. And when you have Islam in the West or Muslims in the West, you have a very odd opposition because you have one that is a religion and ideology, or if you say Muslims, a group of people who can move around, versus a geographical area or region. And so that sort of doesn't meet. And it's somewhat inappropriate if you view it as two similar things in opposition to each other. It's not appropriate. On the other hand, if one viewed it as the West being a fixed geographical area and Islam as some kind of suffusion of some ideology into that area from outside of it, then that might be something that would be more conceivable. But it still wouldn't necessarily be a proper way of viewing things. Persons like myself and Sheikh Hamza and Dr. Barbara, because we're going to use first name basis here, are all Western and Muslim at the same time. And I can't deny that I'm a Western person, that I've grown up Western, that my family is Western, that nobody in my family except me is a Muslim, although my father, may Allah have mercy on him, became a Muslim 9 days before he died of cancer a little over a year ago. And so being Western and Muslim at the same time naturally makes a great problem for us when we are confronted with the dialogue between civilizations or the conflict of Islam and the West or whatever. I guess because we don't see any particular conflict there, at least not between Islam and the West as things. And of course, deconstructionists and postmodernists will say, well, these are all inaccurate designations because we are reifying things. That is, we're making Islam into a concrete thing, and it isn't that. And certainly, if we do that, it denies the pluralism. That's why the title of this lecture is Muslims and the West rather than Islam and the West. And I hope you've gotten the idea from our lectures here, at least, that Islam has great variety in it, and there's a great deal of difference in it, and in fact, a considerable lack of unity that often troubles the Muslims. Okay, so these are some of the problems of the terms. And if we reinterpret the conflictual aspect of this relationship as being the anxiety of Western power elites about Islam and Muslims, and we were to see that in such terms as it being kind of a power relationship, then we would see that there can be a kind of oppositionism in that sense, because nobody wants to be lorded over or ruled by anybody else. And yet, the power structures of the world are in fact very hierarchical. And that leads to a great deal of the sense of unease that pervades the American society anyway, because the Americans are nurtured on concepts of equality and democracy to a very large extent, and many people are observant that although it's on the books legally and constitutionally, is subverted somewhat by economic power structures such as exist in our country. And so one side of the coin being voting, elections, democracy, constitution, and so on. On the other hand, freedom of enterprise and ownership means the ownership of some and the non-ownership of others, which is obviously very inegalitarian. And we have huge disparities in that area, especially leading to an underclass, which most certainly feels very disenfranchised. And that often is indicated by their, quote, voting with their feet, unquote, by not voting in the elections, not participating in the political process. In fact, that idea of political participation is something that splits the American Muslim community right down the middle, because I would say half of the American Muslim community favors it, including, by the way, nearly all of your teachers at this conference are on that side, but another side representing trends that perhaps are more typical of the underclass denounce the idea of political participation and oppose it on the grounds that it would give legitimacy to what they view as an illegitimate system. So anyway, there are these other kind of tensions that exist even in the American society. And so if you go outside of that to the world and look at how the actual power relationships are, you can see grounds for a lot of dissatisfaction, and that could create conflictual relations. In the past, of course, there has been a stereotype of conflictual relationships, in that there were various wars of religion, and because history is loaded with event-oriented descriptions rather than development-oriented descriptions. That is, events attract the attention of historians. Events get written down, memorized, celebrated, discussed, analyzed, and developments, silent developments, don't. And so one thing is noticed and the other is not. Today in our news, of course, the things that would be noticed would be, like some kind of bombings or so-called terrorist incidents, etc. Whereas the fact that so many Muslim women returned to wearing the hijab or head covering, as indeed my wife and her sister and her mother did on their own against the opposition of all the males in their family who didn't want them to cover up, that is relatively ignored. It's not completely unfeatured in any of our media, but it's not emphasized, although it's a much more important development that has affected a far larger number of people. And that is not only because of, there may be indeed some bias in the press that wants to paint Islam and a bad picture of Islam, but on the other hand, it's also just that events attract attention, and all the history books of all countries are filled with this event-oriented history versus developmental-oriented history. And of course, in the last 50 years, there has been a vast change of emphasis toward more development-oriented history, and that has successfully played out to some extent on the European historical area, but there's still a lot of work to be done on other historical areas. So if you study the history of Islam, the history of India, the history of China or Japan, you're going to get a lot less social history than in proportion than you would get from Western history. That's almost for sure. And the result of this is also, as far as the Muslims in the West go, to the extent the Muslims were not in pre-modern times located in the West, to the extent that they were a separate civilization, an independent thought universe living apart from the European thought universe. Of course, painting events usually paints bad relations and leads to this classical stereotype of war. Now, I think that Karima was talking to you about the Muslim contribution to the Renaissance and so on, and that is the other side of it, which is the more developmentally oriented side. Because in spite of hostile relations across borders, there were always friendly relations also, and that is something that needs more emphasis, especially if we are to cultivate the idea of pluralism in our educational system. That is that there were lots of cultural contacts that went across the supposed boundaries of hostility and led to nurturing exchanges of ideas that furthered human civilization altogether. And so that is something in the past that is important to observe, and I will be sufficed by what Karima has told you on that and move on so I can concentrate more on the present as I'm speaking to you today.